Hello and welcome to another episode of the Creating Belonging podcast. Today I have with me Tami Chapek. Tami, would you mind introducing yourself to everyone?
Hi, so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Justin. As you mentioned, my name's Tami. I'm an executive leadership coach, and I started my business, We Inspire We, about 6.5 years ago, which is crazy to say out loud. And I started it because I really saw, my passion and purpose kind of coming together and supporting other people to grow.
Typically, we like to discuss just any identities that you want to disclose ahead of our conversations that may add context to our conversation. What might you want to share today?
Coming into this, there's a lot of options to dig into on a lot of identities that, I've had to really grapple with over the past. One thing that I think just organically comes out of the work that I do is, being a female leader in a white male dominated space. And I'll kind of share a little bit of my backstory and what led me into the business that I have today. But the high level of it is I grew up in marketing and advertising, and I had all male bosses. So as I went from junior employee who knew absolutely nothing, stepping into the business world and even into, my highest role before I stepped out of corporate was a vice president. And I virtually the entire time had male bosses. I had a couple of female bosses, but across the board, they, I would say, replicated a lot of masculine and male behaviors. I found myself doing that as a young person, not consciously, really kind of masking my values and who I was and how I was showing up without realizing it. And it did not work, did not help me. So I had to really figure out a lot of that stuff of how do I view myself? What does that really look like? And how do I become a great leader that's authentic to me and really stepping into who I am and what I can deliver to the world? And that then led to me saying, gosh, I want to help other people find this way faster and not have to have as many hiccups or hurdles along the way that I had to go through.
Okay, good. So female in a male-dominated industry, any other identities that you might want to throw in?
Yeah, I think, I can break it down a lot, on the personal side of the house. One thing that still is glaring to me and something I grapple with, especially around the Christmas, New Year's season. I don't know why that time of year is the hardest, but, I'm 45 years old and I'm single, never been married, no kids. And I feel I get a lot of judgment and a lot of questions about that and a lot of what's wrong with you? Why haven't you found a partner? Because society says we should be partnered off. We should have families. We should be, married, whatever the thing is. And I don't fit into that world at all. A lot of different reasons. I can also layer into there, that singleness cascades into my relationship with my family. Again, all married off, all have children. And so then I'm this weird outlier. I turn it into being the fun aunt, right? Which is great. But I am often the odd person out in many situations. I think I can layer into that even more into family, right? I have a very religious family, and I would say I'm a spiritual person. So there's some lack of belonging and connectivity there. And I could go on and on and on, right? But those are some that jump right out at me at the beginning.
Okay, awesome. So that gives us a lot to work with today. And we'll see if we can not go 3 hours. So let's go back to the first piece that you were talking about, your business, and We Inspire We. I want to dig in a little bit there and kind of talk about, belonging, the role of belonging in your background, and then how that informs the work that you do today.
Yeah, as I mentioned, when I was growing up in that business world, without realizing it, I just emulated the behaviors of the people around me. So my favorite example, and he is still a very close personal friend to this day, but a boss I had was a first generation Italian who grew up in New Jersey. So he had this very strong, dominant, bold personality. And for him, it worked, right? He was very authoritative and was very senior in his career. And, maybe it didn't flow, or people loved him, people hated him. There was no in between, right? But I found myself starting to emulate some of his behaviors as a young white female, right? And without all those years of experience and without those ethnic roots. And I got hand slapped. Like, what are you doing? You're too aggressive, too assertive. And, women talk about this a lot. It's called the double bind, but there's the two factor that comes in. You're too much of these things when other people might not be judged for it. But, that was one of the first times I realized, and it probably was 27 maybe, that I realized that, gosh, I can't act like that. That's not working. Well, what does work? And it led me down this whole path of self-discovery. Who am I? What do I have to offer? What are those things that are authentic and true to me? And what are my values? What do I really appreciate and what is meaningful to me in life? And start to put those pieces of the puzzle together. Certainly there was trial and error to figure out what stuck, what didn't, what worked, what didn't, and what still needed to be massaged. But that was probably the first time I realized that I was not behaving like me as a person, but a behavior that I thought I should have. And that disconnect really kept me out of being successful and kind of having that like sense of belonging in a leadership role.
Yeah. So I'd love to dig in a little bit on the authenticity side. We in the creating belonging model, we have authenticity, acceptance, belonging created at the middle of those. So yeah, your journey was really kind of finding yourself outside of emulating what you thought was just good leadership behavior. I want to talk about that a little bit more. So like, I don't know, just tell me a little bit more about that process. I know you've done a lot of reflection on that journey.
Yeah, it's many, many years in the making, and it's hard to summarize, but this is really the basis of what I do every day now in my business, is helping people uncover what it is that they have that's special and unique to them. What are your natural strengths and tendencies, gifts and talents? And truly, what are your values, right? What are those things that motivate you, light you, kind of your North Star that allow you to wake up and show up every day? And really shining a light or raising awareness to those things. And once you have that, then you have the decision of saying, okay, what do I do with this? And I joke with my clients a lot, awareness is half the battle, right? Like once you know what you've got, then you can figure out what to do with it. But if you don't know, you're starting, at zero. You've got nothing to really pull out for yourself. And so that was a huge part of my process, was figure, okay, what am I good at? What do I like doing? What are those things that give me joy and satisfaction and fulfillment? What are the things that I'm good at? And also analyzing, even if I'm good at it, do I like doing it? Because there's a disconnect there sometimes too.
Right.
And, values, I think, is such a broad word that we don't always understand, but really getting into what are those things that matter most to me? And I'm a very relationship oriented, like highly connected person. And I don't mean that by way of like networking connections, right? I mean it by way of like connected to the heart, to the inner person, right? I really believe that, relationships and people are really, what makes the world go around. It. As I was walking into those higher and higher roles, I was just focused on work. This is the stuff that has to go out the door, and kind of putting relationships and the connections to people to the wayside, almost dismissing the humanity of it because it was about like getting the work done. So I know I'm talking in circles a little bit here, but the end of the story, right, is like the realization of those things and where I was missing, and then starting to figure out how to integrate it back in and embrace that for who I am, and use that as a way, even if it's different than my leaders around me, as a way to help bring the best out of people, still have great results from a work perspective, but finding the balance between those things.
And then if you were to contrast, like then thinking about your sense of belonging early on when you were emulating others and weren't really, in your authentic self, versus when you really had leaned into and settled into your authenticity, like contrast your sense of belonging between those two periods.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say, like, my gut instinct is to say to you, right, like in those early days when I was emulating others' behaviors, I belonged in that club. I belonged with those leaders that I was emulating. Like they accepted me as one of their own because I was just replicating what they did. And there's, the whole human psychology, people that we like, we want to work with and do similar things, right? So that became a very close-knit and tight group. And so to this day, I'm still friends with all three of those bosses that I had at that time, right? So I had this really strong sense of belonging with them, but it was in opposition to everybody else, in opposition to all the people that I worked with. And I was in a cross-functional matrix kind of role where I was working with people in my function, in, creative functions and finance and accounting functions, like all across the board. And if you think about different personalities, different motivators and intrinsic values were very different. So I was excluded from fitting in and belonging into those groups. So there's this huge tension that happened there. So over time, realizing that the tension and disconnect and those things weren't coming together and having to kind of step more into my authentic self and own it allowed me to belong and have a sense of acceptance across all of those groups. Maybe not 100% in every capacity, but with that acceptance of self and acceptance of others, right? It really started to click and come together.
Yeah. Okay, so something hit me, and I haven't thought of this from this angle yet in all of the work of creating belonging, and I know you're familiar with the model, but like, would you say that in that time then, when you were emulating these other leaders, but still then kind of excluded from everybody else because you were in this like exclusive club, that sounds to me actually like minimizing, because you're like covering up and putting on this other facade. And so there was like this fake belonging that happened, but really you were sitting and minimizing. That's what I was like, the picture that, what would you say?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. I probably was without realizing, right? But I also think, and one of the things you called in your book is, the fluidity of the model, right? Like there are parts of me, that behavior I emulated, there are parts of me that embrace that are that directive, assertive, get the work done, drive for results. Like there are parts of me that's very natural too. So even though I was emulating their behavior, it still wasn't a disconnect from components of me. It wasn't disconnect from the purity or the full sense of my values and who I am. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, I just thought of like the worst analogy. So I was just watching this cooking video the other day, and they were like, it was that, oh my gosh, Ethan Chamblasky, something like that on YouTube. And he does all these like science videos of like, I swear this is going to have a point. All these videos of like the science behind food. And so he was doing this one with garlic, and like, what's better, fresh garlic or like chopped garlic in a jar, or granulated garlic, or, dried diced garlic. And what you're making me think of is how like the moral of the story is fresh whole garlic is always the best, no matter what. But actually, like dried minced garlic or powdered garlic isn't bad. Like jar garlic, throw it out. But like then dried garlic isn't bad. But the issue with it is because it's been processed, it's like only one dimension of flavor.
Yeah.
Opposed to all the dimensions that you could incur.
Yes.
So I'm going to say that like you were like the dried mint Tammy, right? Like you were something that was still natural to you, but it was like emphasized one dimension of you and not the rest of you.
Yes. I think that's a wonderful analogy. And it's true, right? It was a component of me, right? It was a talent, a skill, right, that I had, but it wasn't the best version of it or the fullest version of it, right? It was
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a beautiful metaphor. That's there. And like, if you really want to, like, maybe I'll link to the episode. It's like a 20-minute episode on garlic. But no, that makes sense. So like, you weren't necessarily, you were partially minimizing. You were minimizing some of your stuff, but there was some that like, you weren't acting out of complete unnatural. You just found this piece inside of you that actually fit and worked, but you didn't get to use the rest of.
Yeah, that's like, yeah, and bear with me on this and certainly challenge the way I'm setting this up, right? But it's almost like with that group of leaders, that component became that sense of belonging with them. And that was the only thing that was focused on or emphasized. So everything else was minimized everywhere else, right? So it's one of these things. The minimization, right, is what kept me from truly belonging in the rest of the audience around.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so that's I like that, and that's just like an example of. I think the moral of the story is whole fresh garlic is the best, and when we can be our full authentic self. Granted, we've got to balance that with good, radical acceptance of others. But I love that. Okay, I want to switch gears because there is a subject that you mentioned that I don't think we've talked about. Like, we haven't talked a lot about relationships. I think one episode this season we dipped into a very surface relationship, but you had mentioned, single woman, 45. You said your age, so
it's true. It's my age.
own it. And so there, that impacts your belonging in different groups in different places. I would love to explore that and just understand a little bit more.
Yeah, candidly, in every dynamic, I can't think of one where it doesn't come into play. And maybe I'll think a little bit harder on that, but it's separates me from, I'm different from in most situations, right? When I look at my family, parents, siblings, everyone's married, everyone has children, right? So there's a disconnect for me. When I look at my group of friends, and this has changed over the years, right? When I was in my 20s, I wasn't an anomaly. Now that I'm in my 40s, I am kind of an anomaly. I have very few friends that I can put in the same bucket as me. But, everyone's married or has children or both, right? So there's a separation there. And that plays into, how you manage your daily life, where you show up, what your interests are, your priorities, your flexibility. Everything changes when you have other things in the mix. She was up at work, back when I was in corporate America in particular, I would carry a lot of guilt that I've had to work later to compensate for my married or parented friends or colleagues, right? Because they needed to go home and take care of the rest of their life. I didn't have anything waiting for me. Therefore, I should pick up the slack. And I know I'm not alone in that. I've talked to a lot of single people who feel the same way, carrying this around with them. So I just think that there's so many legs to it. I meet people for the first time, and that's one of the first questions they ask, regardless of who they are, right? Like, well, tell me about your family. From my mom, right? Like, I don't think that's what they're really asking. So it is a big disconnect. And I don't know that it's always limiting, right? But I am very different than most people, especially in my age category.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. It's something that, so I, forever, up until 7 years ago, identified as like the single professional. And it's weird now to think like, oh, wow, I've been in a relationship now for 7 years. So like, I'm not that same person. But I totally remember like being in my 30s, and this isn't a gender remark necessarily, other than a stated fact of the specific incidents. Like, I worked with a lot of senior leaders, male senior leaders, who had wives who didn't work.
Yeah.
And so like, I found myself stressed out because like, I didn't have time to pick up my dry cleaning. Like, I would be working 12+ hour days, and they had their lunches ready from their stay-at-home partner. They had their laundry taken care of from their stay-at-home partner. I'm like, when do I get to do laundry? Like, nobody's doing this to me. And not that we need someone to be at home doing those things, but that was something that I remember from those days.
Yeah. Support system, right? There's a go-to person in your life. And certainly, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that being in a relationship means that your world isn't perfect, right? Because I know there's other complexities that come into it too, right? But, there's a whole support system and a whole other set of priorities and a whole other set of roles that get tied to people in those categories. Whereas being a single person, those aren't there. And so then, society kind of says there's something wrong with you if you're not in one of those places. It's hard to not feel that way from time to time when you have other people around you. And I can't tell you how many times I've been asked the question, so why are you still single? Like almost as if like, what am I doing wrong? I don't know. You tell me why I'm still single.
Yeah. It's said there's so much judgment in there yeah. But that's a weird question. I've never asked that. I don't think I've ever asked that because I identified as like a perpetual single person for so long. I hope that I would never.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think people best intentions, right? I don't think people mean and that's degrading, but it does come across as like, I don't know. You tell me. This can be really off-putting.
Yeah, for sure. And the other dimension of that, I think relationships and kind of, I would broaden it to say like non-cis hetero relationships where like, when you don't have kids, like I've never had kids, I will never have kids. Like there's also that dimension and different expectation, right? Like there's that guilt of like, you should work later because you don't have kids. So even if you were in a relationship, so it's like the relationship and it's a parental status that is othered a bit.
Totally. And even, I remember my last agency job, I had just gotten a dog for the first time. And that was like, all of a sudden, I have a reason to leave the office. I have something waiting for me. and it kind of released some of that guilt that I had inadvertently been carrying around of like, well, they have to go home to their kids, or they have to go home and take their kids to soccer, or whatever the thing is, right? Like, so all of a sudden now I had this other responsibility. I don't know, it was just like this interesting shift for me. So having that, being in this silo, this world where you don't have those things, you can carry a lot of other things, other pressures on you that people don't realize.
Yeah. Because this is the first time we're discussing this topic, like broadly on the podcast, I'm curious how, if there's people who are listening who are like, oh my gosh, I totally get this, Tami. Like, I'm in that seat too. Like, how have you positively managed that in the past?
I don't know. Have I?
I feel like there's an assumption that I have.
Well, there's a couple of things. And I think, depending on your intention of the question, right? How have I managed it for myself and my own sanity, right? And psychological safety? How have I managed it with other people to help educate and maybe bring them along in a different way, right? So do you intend one or the other or both? Both
are great.
Yeah. So for me, I think the big thing is around full, self-acceptance, right? And sorry if you see my dog. So I have to accept and believe that I am an amazing person, right? Like there's nothing wrong with me. I just haven't found somebody that I want to spend time with in that capacity. And openly, I will tell you, many years I didn't even try, right? I was so focused on work, focused on other priorities, right? It just wasn't a big thing for me. It was deprioritized. And that, that led to where I am today. So part of it is true acceptance of this is my situation. This is where I am, right? And I am just fine and I am whole without that other side of the house. When it comes to the outside perceptions, right? Like that's where it gets hard. And that's why I always feel like holidays are a hard time because there's a lot of let's family get together. Let's, have coupled off things. I spent New Year's with my brother and a bunch of his married friends this year. Being the single person odd man out, right? And so I had to like hype myself up going into it, like, it's fine, we're all just people, and really kind of separate some of those things out. So I think the big thing is like your mental state and acceptance of where you are and knowing like if you desire to be in a relationship, great, taking actions toward that, but acceptance of the place that you are today, first and foremost, is number one. And then, it comes to people and kind of putting that pressure on you or asking those kinds of questions like, why are you still single? I find that two things I need to do two things to be successful. And one is truly believe they have best intentions, right? Like they believe that that's the best way for them to be happy for they're shining that light on me in the same way, right? Maybe it's the case, maybe it's not the case. So I need to believe that to have that same kind of open relationship and connection with them and not feel judged by them, right? I need to have best in assumptions kind of walking into it. And then I do believe that there's a time to, kind of educate and share perspective on why those kinds of questions maybe aren't most productive. And so I've had people ask me like, well, why are you still single? And posing back, thought-provoking questions like, well, again, you tell me, what do you see? And that's a really quick way to get people uncomfortable.
Now, why aren't you single?
Yeah, right. Or what's the harm in being single? I'm just kind of putting back questions on people to get them to think like, gosh, maybe that didn't come across with my intentions or the way that I meant it to.
Yeah.
I had someone recently ask me about, my dating or seeing anybody. And I asked back like, well, basically like, why is it you believe that people need to be in a coupled off relationship? Right? And just kind of put it back to them. And so, it's not, I don't mean it in a degrading way, but I mean it in a way to educate like, gosh, there are other ways to live your life than the way that you do.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I love the first point of just the self-acceptance. Like, how do you feel about it? Are you okay with it? Like, accept it. Like, here's where I am. And then you can be much more comfortable in being authentic with it and then engaging those conversations of like, well, why aren't you single? I kind of love that. Like, I have more fun, whatever, leave me alone.
Right. My favorite is when my sister would ask questions like that when she was younger and she would talk about her children and I'd point out the wrinkles on her forehead. Like that.
Yes. And the family thing, what's interesting? You just made me think of something explicitly that I think I've thought about. But like, as my younger, like perpetual single self, like family stuff, like I moved away from my family. They're all still in Iowa. And like, the expectation is for holidays, for all of that, like you just come home. Like what else do you have to do? Like you're single, you're mobile. We all have appendages that we need to care for. and now being in a relationship. And it's been more in the past recent few years that there's just now like just past some things. So like there are potentially other things. And now like the odd thing is it counterintuitively gives me a little more agency over my life compared to family.
Yes.
I don't know, because you've been an excuse. I don't know. It's just weird.
No, because there have been years where I have not been so inclined to come home for specific holidays for various reasons, going on a trip or doing something for myself. And I've gotten a lot of backlash from my family on that. Like, why aren't you here? You need to be here. This is time for family. And your lack of understanding of there are other things, outside of their perception of what needs to happen in my world.
Yeah. There's so much there. Family's really challenging. Well, Tami, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I love the conversation. We got a little bit of professional stuff. We got a little bit of personal stuff. And I love all of it comes back to that authenticity of, on the, understanding that our full, fresh garlic selves, and then being comfortable with kind of who we are in our situation and being able to navigate our spaces in that way. So I love it. Tami, thank you so much. I'll make sure that I provide some links so people can find you, connect with you. But is there anything that you would like to share before we close out about how people can find you or anything you want people to know about you?
Yeah, I think the recap I'd love to share just around authenticity, right, is it's so important to know who you are today, but also who you want to be, right? There's always that aspirational side of the house where we want to know how we want to grow and continue to evolve as a person. And, especially as I think about that, the corporate me, and as I was growing and trying to figure out how to be an authentic leader, that took time and that took practice and kind of figuring out, like, how do I show up? How do I lean into these things that are most important to me, et cetera? So I just kind of want to caveat that, right? Like it is self-acceptance and it is understanding of who you are, but there's still room for growth and kind of just keeping an eye on that as well.
Great.
So how to find me, and please reach out to me on LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook or whatever. I would be happy to connect. My company is We Inspire We, and my name is Tami Chapek, and those are easy Googles because there's not a lot of them out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tami, and everyone else. Join us again for another episode of the Creating Belonging podcast. See you soon.